Hi everybody, this is Stephen Roselle, Technical Specialist at Autodesk, and I'm going to review the release of BonusTools 2016 to correspond with the recent release of Maya 2016. So as you know, Maya 2016 came out a month or two ago, and following up from that, we're releasing BonusTools, which is basically a companion, an add-on. It's been around for a long time, and of course with every major release, we update BonusTools as well. And one thing that came along as part of this release is the reorganization of the BonusTools UI. So, of course, if you've seen Maya 2016 by now, you've noticed that we've reorganized not only the menu system at a high level, but also at a low level, including the actual organization of the menus themselves. So not only have we created something like a rigging menu, but we've broken it up and categorized it in a very similar way to the Maya menu system for 2016. Another nice change for 2016 is the addition of the marking menus, or the integration rather. So we've integrated all of the BonusTools modeling tools directly into the standard Maya marking menus, which should make them easier to access and easier to work with. So now I'm just going to briefly run through and review the various tools. So the first thing we'll show is a new menu called Edit, which contains duplicate tools, which kind of correlates to the main Edit menu where you have your standard duplicate functionality for doing various types of duplication in Maya. And in here we've got a couple of new tools. One is something called a duplicate as mesh reference. So what this is a one-directional instance. If I apply this to a poly object, what I end up with is, again, a one-directional instance, so that I can, much like an instance, go in and edit the original mesh, and I'll get something like this, where I'll have the edit passed on to the other object. But it's a composited effect, so I can in turn make some edits to the target mesh, and then that becomes essentially kind of like a layer onto the other mesh. This is a functionality that's been in Max for a while. It's been hidden in Maya, but now it's easily accessible through the poly menus, or rather through the edit menu of BonusTools. This applies to things like topological changes as well. So if I were to go in and add extrudes or bevels and things like that, it works in the same way. Another new tool is Paint Duplicate on Object, and what this tool basically does is it allows you to select a source object followed by a target object, apply the tool Paint Duplicate on Objects, and we get a simplified user interface for creating duplicate or instance objects on this target. So now I can just click Paint. So this is much like the old Paint Geometry tool, but it's a much simpler interface and a little bit easier to use. You can still use the old tool, and there are instructions on how to access that. But this basically gives you a select and apply operation with a few simple options. We also have the ability of going in and doing things like aligning and grouping and whatnot, so that I can position these and orient these to the normal of the surface. And then we've got modifiers as well. So if I hold Control, I can go in and paint remove, much like I would with something like a standard paint tool where I'm inverting the operation. And then if I hold Shift, I can go in and modify things like the scale or the rotation. So if I were to go in and turn on Y scale, X scale, and so on, let's just use Y scale, and I hold Shift, I can go in and I can randomly modify the vertical scale of all these, and then if I hold, then I can basically go in and reapply that. So I can go in and make modifications along the way. Another simple tool is under the Create menu. We have something called a Mesh Locator, and a Mesh Locator basically gives you exactly that. It gives you a locator that is actually a piece of geometry. So it looks and acts much like a standard locator in Maya, although standard locators in Maya do not have thickness. This actually creates a length attribute, which allows you to control the length of the arms, as well as a thickness attribute, which allows you to control the thickness of those arms, and they are relative to one another. So now I can create a more visual and also renderable form of a locator very easily. Also under the Create menu, we have added the ability to create separators, which can be applied to shelves. This is actually in Maya 2016, but hidden from the UI. I'll go to BonusTools, Create, and I'll say Create Separator on Shelf, and you'll notice I get a separator here, which I can basically start to move around. If I move objects to the side of this, now I have a visual separator between those. So now I can come in and create another one, say for instance here, and I can start to move these around to create as many separators between these various tools as I need. Under the Modify section, we have a couple of new tools, one of which is a tool for working with curve pivots. So when you create curves, by default, the pivots of those curves are going to be relative to the origin. So if I scale and or rotate, it's always going to be working relative to the origin. This tool will simply move the pivot of each curve to its own unique origin. In other words, its 0 control vertices. So now that as I rotate these, I can rotate them relative to the base of the curve. This can be very useful when dealing with things like guide curve creation for XGen, for instance. We've also added an edge segment snapping tool, which basically quickly enables a hidden preference that allows you to snap to divisions within an edge. So for instance, if I take this object here and I hold C and middle click on an edge, I can freely constrain that object to the length of an edge. But if I wanted to snap to the center point, now I have the option of choosing midpoint, thirds, or quarters. So if I choose midpoint, and now I click on this edge, you can see it snaps directly to the midpoint. If I choose, for instance, quarters, and now I click on this edge, now I can snap to 25%, 50, and 75% of that edge. When I turn this off, it disables the snapping altogether. We have a number of new tools in the display section as well. So one of these is the ability to toggle the X-ray on a per mesh basis. So we've had the ability to turn on X-ray for the entire view for a while. This will allow you to see through objects from one to the other. But now what I can do is turn that off and instead X-ray on individual objects, and this is supported in Viewport 2.0. So now when I X-ray, I'm only X-raying the selected object. I'm not X-raying all of the objects. And that becomes a simple toggle where I can turn that off and on for one or more objects simultaneously, like so. We've also added a little tool called orthographic control, which gives you heads-up display buttons so that as you're working with objects that are offset from the origin, you can quickly go into, say, for instance, a right point of view or a right orthographic view. And by default, this is an unorbitable, uneditable point of view. So here I have the ability to unlock, which will allow me to rotate that. Once I do, then my rotate pivot can quickly get off-centered. So we have a frame option, which will center on a given object. So I can select an object and frame that, grab another object and frame that, and I can quickly move around it in a standard orthographic kind of perspective, or rather lack of perspective. And then if I need to, I can reset. Everything will go back to the default orthographic view. It's still editable though until I reset and lock, in which case it goes back to a standard orthographic view. The traditional or classic gradient background in Maya has been disabled by default, so that can be enabled very quickly just by turning on the set background grid to classic, and that will reset the orthographic, or rather the gradient view for our perspective, much like we had in 2015 and prior. The frame rate visibility on the lower right-hand corner of your viewport can often be very difficult to read, so we've created a floating frame rate counter that will basically enable a floatable UI, which can be enabled also in the viewport under dimensions, and that will give you an actual transform that contains a simple floating counter on it. So if I just position that in my scene, you can see there that that will now update with my current frame rate. Because this is on a transform, I can place this anywhere in my scene and I can see this relative to a character or a given environment. There have been a number of new modeling tools added as well. If we bring up the modeling menu, we can see that we have a new tool called Combine and Copyless Pivot. If I take these three objects, you can see that each one of them has a unique pivot. If I were to go in and scale each one of these along Y, you can see that each one is scaling differently, as well as rotation is going to rotate differently. So if I were to use the standard combine for these, what would happen is the pivot would end up in the middle of my object, so that if I scale and or rotate, it's going to be relative to the center pivot. If I undo that, I can take any one of these objects as my source, for instance the last selected object, and I can combine and then copy that pivot. Now when I scale, these objects get scaled relative to the point of the cone. Likewise when I rotate them. If I'm working with an object that has insided faces, I can now choose one of those insided faces and apply convert insided to quad, and it will automatically generate a quad based on that. Likewise, you can select the entire object and apply the operation, and it will find all of the insided faces within the structure and convert them to quads. If I select an edge loop on a given object and I apply the standard slide edge tool, then you can see that by sliding that I'm stretching or distorting the underlying UVs. So we now have a new option called slide edge loop and preserve UVs, which will recalibrate the UVs based on the new slide of those edges. All of the modeling tools from BonusTools have been integrated into the marking menu sets. So for things like faces and or vertices, or edges, we now have a Bonus Tools section at the bottom of the marking menus that correspond to whatever is selected or highlighted. Similar to the example before, if I did an extrude by default, what you'll see is the UVs will actually distort based on the change. So you can see I get distortion here as I begin to scale or extend my extruded face. If I undo that a couple of steps, if I were to go into my marking menus now and apply extrude and preserve UVs, what you'll notice is that now, using the Bonus Tools version, my UVs will get preserved as I apply that extrude. So again, all of the various tools are accessible from within the Bonus Tools sub-marking menus. In the rigging menu set, at the bottom, we have a section for performance utilities. These are all utilities that are associated with the new performance updates in Maya 2016. For instance, rather than having to go to the preferences, we can simply toggle on and off parallel evaluation. So we can switch to standard DG mode, and then we can switch back to parallel evaluation to compare our frame rates. We can also do the same thing with GPU acceleration, toggling it on and off, as well as the options for OpenSubdiv and OpenCL, which are associated with performance. We have GPU acceleration statistics as well, which will basically print out in the viewport all of the nodes in your scene that are currently supported with GPU acceleration. Similarly, in the FX menu, we now have an option for Bifrost memory usage. This will print out the amount of memory that is being used by a Bifrost simulation in your script editor or in your command feedback. And then we also have a batch simulation tool, which will actually run outside of Maya. And there's a README doc associated with this that explains how to use it, but the essential idea is that you can batch a Bifrost sim externally from Maya, running Maya in a command line mode without having to open the Maya interface. This is a combination of an external Python script and an internal Mel script, which could be run through command line, and the instructions are contained within the README file. There are a couple of handy new tools in the rendering menu set, one of which allows you to quickly associate new shaders for each object. So if we take a look at the hypershade for these objects, what you'll see is that each one of these objects is using the same default material. If I were now to select each of these objects and assign a new material for each, now each one of these objects will contain a new material that is essentially a copy of the default, but it will be associated independently with each object. Now if I were to undo that and go into the options, we also have the option of randomizing the color for each one of these new materials. When I apply that, what you'll see is I get essentially default materials, but if you look in the viewport, each one of them has been subtly randomized so that I can distinguish between each of my materials. We've also added a very simple turtle batch render tool that will allow you to render an image sequence from using the turtle renderer, which is traditionally used for still images or light map baking. If we go into the options, it actually uses the standard rendering options. So for instance, the common parameters with the start frame and end frame and step, not naming conventions, as well as the standard turtle parameters, so for creating indirect lighting and so on. So if I set those up appropriately and then I apply my render image sequence with turtle, now when I apply that, what you'll see is I'm going to get 10 frames in this case, sequentially rendered out using the render view, but then saved out to image. In the end, when my 10 frames are rendered, it will open me up to the image sequence so that I can then go in and view these directly. And lastly, under the Bonus Tools Help menu, we now have a simple option for locating the Bonus Tools installation. So if you scroll down and go to Bonus Tools Install Location, that will actually open up a native file browser, and it will put you at the location of all of the Bonus Tools plugins and scripts. And you can see now I can go into any specific version or release, and I can see the actual scripts that are associated with that release. So if I wanted to customize these in some way, or if I wanted to actually separate out a script, or it allows us to make individual updates to scripts and for you to just simply place those updates directly into the install location. But again, this is just a simple way of getting to the location, which was kind of hard to find otherwise. If you haven't found them already, the new version of Bonus Tools and all the installers for Bonus Tools for both, or rather for all three, Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, are accessible on the Autodesk Exchange. So if you just go to the Autodesk Exchange, which is apps.exchange.autodesk.com, or you can just Google Bonus Tools Autodesk Exchange, You'll find the installers here as well as a place to leave feedback and to review and so on. So hopefully you'll find some useful tools in this release, and thanks for your time. Bye.